respiratory system. This is chapter 16. We're talking about ventilation in this chapter. So first we're going to start off with looking at the relationship of respiration, internal and external respiration, what that means. So let's start with internal. So internal respiration is basically cell respiration. So this is our cell respiration. This is what's going on, how our individual cells are using the oxygen to make ATP, right? So oxidative phosphorylation, oxygen will eventually be used to make ATP. Every single one of our cells needs a copious amount of ATP every day to function. So all the cells are going to require oxygen, and then all of your body cells are going to, secrete or give up their carbon dioxide waste product. And so the oxygen from the bloodstream comes into those cells. The cells utilize that oxygen, and then they create carbon dioxide waste. The waste carbon dioxide goes into the bloodstream, and then that blood will carry it out to the lungs, and then you can exhale it. So internal respiration is what's going on inside each cell, and it's the process of making ATP. External respiration is probably what you all think of as respiration, and that's exchanging gases. So there's two kinds. The first kind is, yes, we're exchanging gases with the atmosphere and our bloodstream. And the second kind of external respiration is what's happening with our tissues, right? So our blood is going to take that gas, bring it to our tissues, and then there's an exchange between the tissues and the capillaries. So that's our second kind of external respiration. So the functions, right, looking at the functions of your overall respiratory system is to do this, is to provide oxygen for oxidative metabolism and generate your ATP, and also to expel the carbon dioxide. As we saw in the blood chapter, too much carbon dioxide in the blood can make the blood acidic. Looking at the other functions, there is a function to regulate the pH of the body, again, because carbon dioxide dissolved in the blood becomes carbonic acid, which donates free hydrogen ions, which drives the blood to be acidic. We're going to look at that in the next chapter. This chapter is concentrating on ventilation. And the last thing here is, though it's not a primary function of your respiratory system, there is an innate structure of immunity that we have in the respiratory system, because the respiratory system is a major way that you get infected from the world. So infections are largely coming into your body two ways: through the respiratory system and also through the gastrointestinal tract, like what you eat. So we're vulnerable here in the respiratory system, and this is, COVID is a great example of how respiratory illnesses can be spread very, very easily. And so there is a host defense here. We have such a large surface area, about a tennis court's worth of surface area for particulates to come into our body, that we have to have this defense. So because I'm talking about this, let's just take a look at that defense now. And that is largely the mucociliary escalator. So I just want to bring you back to look at the lining of your respiratory system. And this is going to be the part of the respiratory system that is upper and most of your lower respiratory system, but not the alveoli. So we're going to have these ciliated cells, and those cells are going to have goblet cells interspersed. So remember, goblet cells are these clear cells, and your goblet cells are going to make mucus. So, right, and the mucus is going to build up on the surface of your epithelium, and that's going to trap these particulates that you're inhaling. So whatever's in the air, right? When you inhale, you're basically sampling what's in the air. It could include mold spores. Most definitely it has mold spores. It's going to have bacteria. It's going to have viruses. It's going to have, outside of mold spores, can be just any fungal spore. It can have pollutants. It can have chemical irritants. It could have smoke from forest fires. So all of those things get trapped inside of this mucus, and then the cilia is going to sweep and move that mucus up, right? So this should be familiar from anatomy. This is called the mucociliary escalator. So this is going to be part of our innate immune system. So it protects our delicate lung tissue from infection. And it works pretty well, although it does get breached, right, whenever we get sick with a respiratory illness. Now let's look at the anatomy. So In anatomy, you learned upper and lower respiratory system, but in physiology, we're going to talk about conducting zone and the respiratory zone because we are concerned about exchanging gases. So the conducting zone is just the part of the respiratory system that does not exchange gas. So, oops, sorry about that. This is very touchy. Doesn't exchange gas. So it brings the air from the outside into the deeper parts of your lung where we do have gas exchange, but it doesn't exchange gas itself, which would include everything up here: pharynx, larynx, trachea, your bronchi. It would include your terminal bronchioles. And that's basically it, because once you reach your respiratory bronchioles, the respiratory bronchioles do have alveoli on their structures, so they do take part in gas exchange. But everything, right, nasal cavity, oral cavity, those are all going to be conducting zones. The conducting zone, you can see, has about 150 mils of gas, air, inside of it. So remember that when you breathe in, the amount of air that you're bringing in to your lungs, a lot of that is going to be still in that conducting zone. So just a portion of that is going to reach your alveolar sacs. So all the air that you're bringing in, about 150 mils of it, are actually just hanging out in that conducting zone, and they're not taking part in gas exchange. The major function of this conducting zone is to humidify and to cleanse the air. We talked about the mucociliary escalator that cleans the air. It humidifies it, warms it, and moistens it. So that's a conditioning kind of process. And by the time the air gets to the alveolar sacs, it should be clean, and it should also be warm and humid so that the gases are able to pass through and diffuse into the bloodstream. It does not irritating the lining of your lungs. All right, the respiratory zone then is just going to be the rest. So let's take a look at this other picture that I have. So this is a review of the anatomy. Here's our conducting zone and here's our respiratory zone, right? So it's a little bit different. Take a look, and I want you to see the smooth muscle. So notice that the smooth muscle is present in the upper airways, bronchi, bronchioles, even all the way to the respiratory bronchioles. Anything that has smooth muscle has the ability to constrict and dilate. So these structures are going to take part in either dilating and creating less resistance for air to flow in, or constricting and creating more resistance for air to come in and out. I also want you to look at the goblet cells. So goblet cells, which secrete mucus can also make excess mucus can also make not gas exchange, but just the conduction kind of difficult. But normal amounts of mucus is healthy. So we have mucus up into a certain point, and then where we get really small diameters, the mucus would be too much. It would just totally occlude that airway, so we lose the mucus at terminal bronchioles. And then the cilia. So we do have cilia still to sweep the particulates out. But when we talk about bronchial constriction and bronchodilation, that's where the smooth muscle really comes into play. All right, just a quick anatomy lesson here with, this is just another look at a terminal bronchiole, which does not have the alveoli. Respiratory bronchioles do. And then we have the alveolar sacs and alveoli. So just a quick reminder that the sac is the entire group of alveoli. It's a sac of alveoli, and then each individual air space is an alveolus. Alveoli is your plural form, right? Let's look at what in between the alveoli you have pores, so they're called alveolar pores, little junctions between the alveolar sacs. So they function a couple ways. They can equalize the air pressure. So because these are all connected, they equalize the air pressure inside the alveoli. They can share surfactant within the alveoli. But sort of a downside is that if there is infection, so if this middle alveolus, you inhaled some bacteria and it started to become an infection, it started to take hold, those bacteria have a way to crawl into your other alveolar sacs because they're connected by these pores. Fluid buildup is the same thing. If this infection created fluid, that fluid can seep into the other alveoli and it can cause breathing problems, gas exchange problems. So that's the downside. So it's clinically significant because you can have infections spread throughout the lungs through these pores. Looking at the alveolus, we can see that there are type 1 cells. These are the really thin epithelial cells. We have type 2 cells, which secrete surfactant, and they actually act also as stem cells. And then we have alveolar macrophages as your innate immune response. So you have just these macrophages living inside of your alveoli so that pathogens that do not get trapped in the mucus on the way down to the alveolus, if they do reach the alveolus, then they can get gobbled up. And not just pathogens, but this can be really, really small particulates. Anything foreign, your macrophages are able to get rid of because they're very voracious phagocytes. Looking at the respiratory membrane, right? So you guys should remember this from anatomy as well. The respiratory membrane is a very thin wall between the capillary and between the alveolar epithelium. And in between, because you can't have these epithelial cells without a basement membrane, but there is a minimal basement membrane and they fuse. So we have very minimal space, very minimal fluid between the blood supply, the capillary, and between the epithelium so that we can have gas exchange, right? So oxygen can come into the bloodstream and carbon dioxide can exit into the alveolar space. All right, so this is a nice SEM image of the structures we kind of just talked about, a bronchiole versus alveoli. And this is a cool picture of the blood supply. So I like to see the alveoli here, and then I see the capillaries. And the capillaries in this image are pretty, I mean, they color-coded it, but it's pretty cool because you can see the individual red blood cells right next to each other, right? So capillaries are so small that they only let one red blood cell in at a time, right? And that slows down circulation so that you can have time for gas exchange to occur. Moving on to the thoracic cavity. What makes up your chest wall? So the wall, which is going to be sealed and does not let air in, right? So it's airtight. It's going to include your rib cage. It's going to include your sternum and the thoracic vertebrae, so on the posterior side, along with the muscles between the ribs. So your intercostal muscles, both the internal and external, are going to form that wall, as well as the diaphragm. So the diaphragm forms the bottom. And after the wall, there's the pleura, right? So let's remind ourselves of the pleura. So the pleura is a double membraned layer. The sac has two membranes. The parietal pleura is on the wall of the chest cavity, so it's on the chest wall. And then the visceral pleura is attached to the lung itself. So there's a small space between those two pleural membranes. That's called the intrapleural space. And that has fluid, and that's going to be pleural fluid or intrapleural fluid, and it's about 15 mils of fluid in there. All right, so now let's start taking a look at some pressures while we breathe. So air moves in and out in your lungs by bulk flow of a pressure gradient. And air, like anything else, moves from high to low pressure. So when you inhale, your lungs have less pressure than the atmosphere. So if you have negative pressure in your lungs, it's less than the atmosphere. The atmospheric air is going to go inside your lungs. It's going to go from high to low. And then the opposite happens when you breathe out. The pressure in your lungs becomes greater than the atmospheric pressure, and air leaves that higher pressure to go outside your body into the lower pressure region. So we'll talk about just, exchange, how that happens in just a bit. Let's take a look at atmospheric pressure, which is pressure ATM, the atmosphere. So it is 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level. It can change, right? So if you go up in the mountains, it decreases. If you are underwater, that pressure is going to increase. And so it doesn't really matter what the atmospheric pressure is in breathing because it's always going to be relative to what's in your alveoli. So all the other pressures that are given here is basically relative to the atmospheric pressure. So we can actually just negate the 750 or 760 because it could be anything. We don't know where we're living. Are we up high on a mountain? Are we at sea level? So we just say 0, okay? Millimeters of mercury. So then there's a pressure of what's inside of your lungs, right? And that's called the intra-alveolar pressure. So we can look here, intra-alveolar pressure, which changes, and it's always relative to the atmospheric pressure. And so it's going to vary when you're breathing. So during inspiration, when you're breathing in, it's going to be negative because air is going to flow towards the negative pressure. So if air is coming into your lungs, you automatically know that your lungs have a negative pressure. And expiration, you know that the pressure is going to be more than atmospheric. So the atmospheric pressure will end up being less or negative, so that the air is going to flow out towards the negative air pressure on the outside of our body. So this difference between the alveolar pressure and the atmospheric pressure is going to drive ventilation. All right, the intrapleural pressure is the pressure that is in that pleural space, in that intrapleural region where you had that fluid. And so it's always negative. And we'll talk about why it's always negative, but it's always going to be negative, and it's always something around -4 millimeters of mercury. So why is it negative? There's this image, and then there's also this next image that we can take a look at. So it turns out that the lungs are elastic and compliant, and the lungs, because of their elasticity, the elastic tissue actually pulls inward. So you can see the box here with the lung, and you see how there's elastic recoil. So when we talk about the lungs being elastic, that doesn't mean stretching out or expanding. That is the word compliance. But when the lungs shrink back down and get pulled back in, that's due to that elastic recoil. So the elastic recoil is going to pull the lungs in to make them smaller. And it's going to pull this way, right? Away, it's going to pull away from the thoracic chest wall. It's going to pull away from that pleural sac. So the forces pulling the lungs inward would be this elastic tissue pulling the lungs inward. And then there is the surface tension inside the alveolar fluid, which also creates an inward pressure. So the intra-alveolar pressure, right, is also going to be sort of a pulling in pressure. Now, what pulls outward? So it turns out that the chest wall, it has their elastic recoil, but the elastic recoil of the chest wall is the opposite of the lung. So the recoil is outwards. So it has this outward pull. So it's pulling against the lungs. And so what's happening is this intermediate area, this intrapleural space, it kind of gets pulled in both directions, right? So it's going to work against the lung, right? It's also going to work against the chest wall. So it turns out that too much or too little pleural fluid would hinder the creation of this negative intrapleural pressure. So this counteracting here and here ends up being overall a -4 millimeters of mercury. And the fluid there is important. So you want to maintain the appropriate amount of fluid, which is why I said too much or too little pleural fluid would hinder the creation of this negative intrapleural pressure. So the level's monitored, and it's made every day and it's drained every day by the lymphatic system. And since the parietal pleura is attached to the thoracic wall, the elasticity of the chest wall opposes the inward pull of the lungs. And ultimately, what happens is there's a little bit more of a pull this way. And so that intrapleural pressure, that negative pressure is going to pull the lungs open. So it keeps the lungs attached to the chest wall. And that's what's important about that intrapleural pressure, is that it's going to keep those lungs slightly pulled out on the chest wall and expanded. Okay, then the next pressure is going to be the transpulmonary pressure. And the transpulmonary pressure is the difference between what is in the alveoli, right, the intra-alveolar pressure, versus what is in that pleural space, that intrapleural pressure. So it's the difference between those. And it turns out that what this pressure does is it causes the lungs to expand. So when you increase this pressure, it will cause the lungs and the alveoli to expand. And when that happens, you're actually making a larger lung, right? So you're expanding that lung because you're pulling the lungs open. So that's the transpulmonary pressure. So the next topic is pneumothorax. So in this example, what would happen if you punctured a hole through the chest wall and there is an opening now for the air? So the air had access to that intrapleural space. The intrapleural space is negative. So how would air want to flow? Air would want to flow into that intrapleural space. It would come in. Okay. And when that air comes in, it's going to fill this intrapleural space. And that's going to change that pressure gradient, right? Whereas the negative, it was pulling the lungs open, and now it's going to not be negative anymore. And what's going to happen is the lungs are going to want to recoil in because their natural state is going to be a recoil, right? Their elasticity is going to recoil, and it's going to collapse that lung. So let's take a look at that picture, right? So if you have, this is the pneumothorax, the air is coming in, and now we have, so we see that the pressure, right, at the onset of the pneumothorax was -4, so this is normal. But then if you let air come in, you're going to equalize the pressure with outside the atmosphere, right? Because the atmosphere, remember, we're going to assume it's 0 millimeters of mercury, the pressure of the atmosphere. So with anything else, it reaches equilibrium. So that intrapleural space becomes 0 to equalize with the outside, and that's too positive, and so the lungs collapse. So that's a pneumothorax. The same concept can happen with blood. So if you don't have a cut or an opening in the chest wall, but you have blood that seeps out, you have an infection or something, or some kind of damage to the lung, and the blood seeps out, this could also be blood, and that could also collapse your lung. Okay, so last thing for part 1 is the mechanics of breathing. So you can see this GIF, and what's happening with this GIF is that when we breathe, we are changing the shape of our thoracic cavity. So when we are inhaling, follow the picture here, when inhaling, we're expanding the volume. So there's a volume and pressure relationship, and they're inversely related. So if you have a greater volume, then if you have a larger volume, then you have a lower pressure. Okay, if your volume goes down, the pressure goes up. So just real quick so I can talk about this while it's moving. So inhale, you see the volume is increasing, pressure drops, and so air is going to come in. As we are exhaling, the volume gets smaller, the pressure is going to go up, so air is going to want to escape. So it's just based on pressure and volume changes between what's going on in the lungs, the pressure of the alveoli versus the pressure of the atmosphere. And what's changing the volume is going to be, what's changing the size of the rib cage or your chest wall are muscles. Okay, so let's look at that. So this is just a couple of illustrations to show you. So this is based on Boyle's law. And it's just an illustration of how pressure and volume are related. So if you have a container at a large volume, the volume is 2, there's not a lot of pressure pushing down on those molecules of gas, right? So the pressure is going to be low. But if you make that volume smaller, cut that volume in half to make it 1, then the pressure is going to go up to 2. So P1 times V1, P1 times V1 is 2. It has to equal any change, right? So here's another illustration of it. As the volume increases, right? So this is, your pressure is going to decrease. So thinking this is your chest, if this is your lungs inside your chest cavity, if you're increasing the volume, you're making the volume bigger, you're decreasing the pressure, pressure becomes negative. What are you physically doing? Are you inhaling or exhaling? So you're inhaling, right? Because the pressure drops and air is going to want to go from the atmosphere inside into the negative pressure. But in that second later, right, if we are going to decrease the volume, so you're going to your chest wall is going to get smaller. This is your chest, or we can say the volume gets smaller. The pressure increases, and the pressure, when it increases, it wants to escape to a negative pressure. So compared to the atmosphere, it's actually, the atmosphere has lower pressure now, so the air is going to go out into the atmosphere. You don't need to worry about that. So the muscles that help you move your chest wall and to expand your thoracic cage, in inspiration, when you inhale, it's your intercostal and your diaphragm. So inhaling is an active process because we do have to contract these muscles. So inhaling is active. You have the nervous system is going to stimulate your diaphragm and your external intercostals, and the diaphragm moves down, right, to give you more room on the inferior border of that thoracic cage. Your external intercostals elevate the ribs, and your whole chest wall will expand. Now, exhaling is a little bit different. Expiration is just relaxing those muscles. So, and I'm talking about just normal at rest when you're breathing and you're just reading a book or, just sitting around not doing anything, in this sort of normal, relaxed breathing. You contract your muscles to breathe in, but then you just relax them to exhale. You're going to relax. But if you want to, and your diaphragm relaxes, if you want to forcefully exhale, then you can engage your internal intercostals and your abdominals. But this is for active expiration only. So if you're blowing out birthday candles and you want to do it, really forcefully, you would engage those two muscles to do that, and your chest and lung cavities contract. So again, when you inspire, your chest wall expands. What happens to the volume? The volume goes up. The pressure goes down. So if we have negative pressure inside your chest compared to the atmosphere, remember, we're always comparing to the atmospheric pressure is going to be higher, and you're going to have the gases come into your mouth and trachea and all the way down into your alveoli and the lungs. In the next second, when your chest cavity is getting smaller, right, the volume goes down, the pressure goes up compared to the pressure of the atmosphere. So now the atmospheric pressure is less than what's in your chest. And so the air is going to want to go to that lower pressure outside. So that's basically how we breathe. Inspiration is more active because you have to contract those muscles. And then expiration, normally, very passive process. You just relax the muscles. And unless you want an active expiration, you can contract those other muscles. All right, so this is your neural input flow chart. Okay, so your motor neurons are going to give that input to your muscles, right? Your muscles are going to contract. Remember, they're the diaphragm and the external intercostals, and you're going to have that chest wall lifted up. The diaphragm also goes down, and it gives that larger space in the thoracic cage. The intrapleural space is going to increase that pull on that fluid, and that pressure is going to go down, and that's going to increase your transpulmonary pressure. So this is something that maybe you just have to memorize. So when your chest expands, it's going to pull on that intrapleural fluid, right? So remember that it's going to pull outwards because the chest is expanding. And that's going to drop the pressure inside that pleural cavity, which is going to increase transpulmonary. So it mentioned before in the notes that when you increase transpulmonary pressure, this makes the lungs larger. So the lungs will actually get larger because of this pressure. In the alveoli, right, we're going to increase the volume of the alveoli. The alveoli also change, so they can get small and big. Increase the volume. It's going to drop the pressure, so the air is going to go in there, right? So if it dropped the pressure of the alveoli, then the air is going to flow towards that negative pressure. And that's about it. So the other things that you're going to increase the difference between the atmosphere and the alveoli. So because the alveoli pressure is dropping, you're going to have the difference between the atmosphere and the alveoli it's bigger, right? Because it's one the alveoli is dropping. So it's going to have a bigger difference. So you're going to have a larger difference in those pressures. Air will flow into the alveoli. And then you have increased alveolar pressure. And that increased alveolar pressure can actually feed back and stop that drop in pressure. But yeah, anyways, there we go. So that's the whole chain of events for inspiration. All right, some review questions. Which of the following is not part of the conducting zone? The answer is respiratory bronchioles, because conducting zone does not exchange gas, but respiratory bronchioles do have alveoli, so it's part of the respiratory zone. What do type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells do? So type 1 is the respiratory membrane with capillaries, and type 2 is going to produce surfactant. So the answer would be number 1, or A. During regular breathing, what is the intrapleural pressure? So the intrapleural pressure in normal breathing, that's that pressure within the pleural cavity, and that's always going to be negative. Which other muscles besides the diaphragm is primary muscle of respiration? And maybe it would be more clear if I had said inspiration, to inspire, to inhale. So that should be external intercostals. All right, and that would be the end of part 1.